today's lesson, we're going to talk about 4 different ways to finish seams. Sewing with a zigzag and trimming, sewing with an overcast stitch, sewing with a zigzag over the edge, and using pinking shears. These are all good methods to finish your seam allowances. When you sew a seam on your fabric, it leaves the right side looking wonderful. But on the wrong side, you're left often with many frayed edges. So today we're going to talk about a few ways you can finish this seam allowance to help minimize those frayed threads. On some projects it doesn't matter, especially if the seam allowance is trapped inside. But on other projects, such as garments or bags, the strings can be a problem, especially when you wash it. So what can you do to help prevent that? One quick way to finish your seam is to use pinking shears. You want to make sure you have a good quality pair so that they can easily cut through fabric. When using pinking shears, you can simply trim your seam allowance in half. And your new cut edge will be less likely to fray. Another way to finish your seam allowance is using a zigzag stitch. I'm going to do a zigzag stitch in the center of my seam allowance here. I have my machine set to my zigzag stitch. I'm going to be using a stitch length of 2.5 and a stitch width of 5.0, but you can adjust that as you like. And I'm just going to center it. After you've sewn your zigzag, you're next going to trim off the far edge. You're going to trim it off to be closer to the edge of the zigzag. You don't want to actually cut your stitches, but you do want to get pretty close. This method works well for fabrics that are a little bit lighter weight and don't hold up well to stitches going over the edge. You can also use a zigzag stitch that goes over one edge. So when the needle pierces on the left, it will go through the fabric, but when it pierces on the right, it will be just beyond the edge. This method can be a little tricky on lightweight fabrics. And so you'll want to make sure that you test your fabric first to see if this is a good option for you. I'm going to keep the same settings on my machine for my zigzag. This time, I'm going to make sure that when the needle goes down on the left, it's on the fabric, and I'm going to make sure that when the needle goes down on the right, it's just beyond the edge. So the majority of the zigzag is going to be on the fabric. It's just the very far right hand stitch that's going to fall off. And so you do need to be a little bit more exact when you're sewing this one. The zigzag over the edge works well for thicker or heavier fabrics. The last method that we're going to use to finish seams is an overcast stitch. The overcast stitch does work best if you have an overcast foot, so if you have one of those, you'll want to switch to that on your sewing machine. And like the zigzag over the edge, you'll want to test your fabric first to make sure it's a good weight for the overcast stitch. Next, I'm going to switch to my overcast stitch. The overcast stitch looks a lot like a zigzag, but in between the zigzags it has a regular straight stitch. I remember this one because it looks a lot like mountains and valleys. When you switch to your overcast stitch, you should still be able to select the length and width. I like to do a wide overcast stitch, so I usually change it to a width of 5.0. And the length you can change depending on how dense you want your stitches. I'm going to leave mine at 2.0. Another thing you'll notice when you switch to the Overcast Stitch is that the indicator for the presser foot has changed. So on your machine you have this little indicator here that tells you what foot to use, and that's the letter that you see above your stitch. So it's telling me to use foot G. And you can see, here's my presser foot, and right there is my letter G, so this is the foot that I should be using for this stitch. When you use the Overcast foot, you can see that it has a little bar right here. That's going to help hold your stitches over the edge. So like when you did the zigzag, one side of your stitch will enter on this section, and then the far right will come over here on the other side of the bar. This bar will provide stability over the edge to help prevent rolling of your fabric. When you align your fabric, you want the edge of your fabric to align with this extension. So this side of the foot comes out farther than the other, and you want your fabric to rest right along this edge so that when your fabric passes through, the needle will go right over the edge of it. So the edge of the stitch will look like a cross between what we saw with our zigzag and what you'd see on a serger. You just aren't using as many threads. Start with your needle down, and again line up the edge of the fabric with that extension. When you stop sewing, because of the bar right here, you're not going to be able to pull your fabric forward. You're going to want to slide your fabric to the back so that it slides off of that little bar. Here's a close-up look at the Overcast stitch.